Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the ninth week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Since 1990, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV, YouTube, and archive.org. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted in the News from Neptune Facebook page. We try to bear in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago. The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. This is a Rootin' for Putin edition of News from Neptune because of an important speech given by Russian President Vladimir Putin this week, which has been massively misinterpreted, misreported by the U.S. media and by the U.S. government. We'll get to that, I'm sure, as the evening goes on. What's top of your list, David?
Well, not in any particular order, but some old business was to refer to a comment that the economist, the very good economist Robert Pollin made, that I don't agree with, in terms of immigrants and the effects of immigrants and immigration on our economy and on jobs and so forth. I don't have the final word for that, but when he argues that areas where you have more immigrants than those where you don't have higher wages, that doesn't seem to solve the problem of how to understand what the effects of the immigrant workforce have been on the quote-unquote native workforce in this country. And I say that because it's just one of a series of issues that I have with people reducing the issue of immigrants and dreamers and so forth to whether you support them or not, or whether you think they should be treated fairly or not. There are broader issues that I referred to in my letter to the editor that was published a couple of days ago that we should be talking about. But it seems like even a very good economist like Bob Pollin at the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass Amherst reduces it to a sort of comparative study of wages, when the overall view is that wages have been stagnant. And certainly immigration policy has had something to do with that. And we shouldn't be afraid to research that and talk about it in ways that help us understand how neoliberalism has worked for the last 30 or 40 years. That just doesn't seem kosher to me, to sort of evade the issue by saying that immigrants have moved in many cases to relatively prosperous urban areas and may provide a low wage, or maybe even more than a low wage workforce for that, in the context of a prosperous economy. That doesn't deal with the fact of what's happening in the Rust Belt or in the Farm Belt or in places where manufacturing has left in the last 30 years.
It seems to me that there's an awful lot packed into the immigration discussion
Yes.
right now, as your letter certainly suggested.
Yeah.
A lot of other things going on there. If we step back a minute, we might ask why there's any discussion about immigration at all. You could have some reasonable border controls in the sense that people who come across the border, whether it's to go shopping in Tijuana or to go visit Bernie Sanders' house in New England,
That's a fascinating contrast there.
It may be a contrast, I'm
Yeah.
not sure. But in any case, we forget sometimes how recent the immigration problem is. I mean,
Right.
it's only at the time of the First World War that the U.S. really began to consider questions of whether people should be allowed to immigrate or not. There were various and sundry racist restrictions before, like the Chinese Exclusion Act and so
Yes,
forth.
1882.
But if we remember Ellis Island and remember the way that a lot of our grandparents got here, it wasn't a result of being allowed to emigrate. They got on a boat and showed up, and or walked across the Canadian border or walked across the Mexican border. The notion that we need strict controls on the border is a very recent phenomenon. Certainly, we could ask people to identify themselves on the border and make sure there are not sort of international arrest warrants out for them or something like that, which should be easy enough to do if we have a system of identification. But other than that, why do we need to control the borders, much less build a wall, as some people have suggested?
Do we need a policy to determine, apparently you're arguing we don't need a policy to determine how many people could come to this country, from where they might come, and what skills they may or may not have. You want to just throw that out the window?
I would be willing to just throw that out the window. As you point out, the question there is a question of labor.
Yes.
That the people who are concerned about immigration to the U.S. right now are people who have been told that these immigrants are taking their jobs away.
Yes.
We know that's not true.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is there is enough of a jobs crisis in this country that people are looking for people to blame that on.
Yes.
And that's been worthwhile for 40 years as wages have flattened in the U.S. I mean, I think one of the most important political facts about the contemporary scene in America is that the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years after the Second World War, 1945 to 1975, an expansion of the American economy and the efflorescence of the American working class came to an end in the 1970s, and that wages in the U.S. have essentially been flat since the mid-70s. That's fueled Trump's election, when people looked back over those years, and realized that the economic possibilities that were open to their parents were not open to them. And we call this populism sometime, but it was an accurate, if unscientific, account of what was happening to work in America. It leads on to some interesting questions. The most interesting one, I think, recently is the question of a universal basic income, which for a variety of reasons seems to me like a very good idea. But the political fact about immigration was that it was interpreted by many Americans as an example of how their economic possibilities were being repressed over the last 40 years, which they were. So the problem is complex in that regard. And if we say, well, we're not going to worry about immigration too much, then we're finally going to have to deal with that question that it's supposedly impacted. That is the economic possibilities for most Americans. And to that, it seems to me UBI is the right answer.
But in terms of wages, if immigrants work for less in some occupations, in some fields, in some areas of this country, in a kind of underground economy, or however that works, don't we need, if we're going to open our borders to immigrants to come and work, don't we need to apply a living wage to them as well, in order to not have them set off against Native American, against citizen, let's just say citizen workers?
Yes, I think that's right. But remember that the best way to get a living wage in this country is to begin with a universal basic income. Yeah. The reason people work for less than a living wage right now is that they don't have any option. If they want to eat regularly, they have got to accept the wages that McDonald's is paying. If they can live on the subvention that a universal basic income would provide,
Yeah.
then they can say to McDonald's, look, I'm happy to go to work for you if you pay me a reasonable amount, but I don't have to take whatever you're offering because I won't starve if I don't.
So, and this is maybe off on a little bit of a tangent, but we're talking about, say, foreign students or visitors, to this, presumably mostly temporary visitors to this country for educational purposes, some who stay. Should the citizens of a state in which allegedly has a public university, should they have some guidelines in terms of understanding how many of the slots at that university are available to citizens of that state or children, growing up in that state, children growing up in other states in this country, and foreign students? Should there be any discussion over how these things are set up in some kind of way that people come to feel appropriately entitled, as opposed to just whatever that does happen, stuff just happens, and then people wake up and they see that that the students who are in this state can't afford to go to college in this state, and then people from China can. So the question is, it's like stuff just happens, okay? And they're told that it just happens because this is the marketplace, and these are the choices people make, and our state government is horrible, and our universities are in bad shape, and they're poorly funded. All this stuff just happens, and then people look up and they say, why don't we just have a university system that can affordably attract students from this state who would probably prefer to stay in this state and get their higher ed at a less, either free, which of course it should be, or at a less cost than, or that people coming from other states, fine, but okay, they pay a little more. You have an incentive structure, you have a kind of a marketplace, but it guarantees that students in this state will have a free education. And somehow the whole immigrant or foreign student thing gets mixed up with that. And here it is, and people say, well, why is it this way? And people, well, they don't really say that because they're afraid to talk about it. But it is this way, and I fear that a lot of people are wondering how it got to be this way and whether it's fair and what the heck is going on.
Well, maybe we should take a leaf from the book of that noted radical Bernie Sanders,
Yeah.
and point out that civilized countries don't charge for higher education. If you go to university in France or Germany, it's free, and it should be so here. Now that leads us back to your earlier question, and how do we decide what places at universities, assuming that they're not infinitely expandable, they may be.
One would hope that they wouldn't be,
Well,
yes.
walk through campus town and tell me that they're not, but still, how do you allocate places at the University of Illinois? Well, first of all, if you have a clientele that really wants to come to the university and is not doing it simply because they are told that the only way they will earn a living wage is that if they get a university degree, a lot of the people who are in colleges right now may not come for a university degree. I mean,
And rightfully so.
and rightfully so.
Yeah.
But that we don't even have to decide that. It seems to me if you decide that you're going to run universities that are open to people from all over, and run them in the way, as I say, civilized countries do, i.e. not charging those people, and certainly not charging them an arm and leg as we do now, then what you do is decide, well, this is the number of students we can take under our current arrangement, and we can allocate them more or less reasonably to residents and non-residents of this state, residents and non-residents of this country.
Yeah.
But that's not a hard problem if it's not a matter of trying to squeeze the last dime out of them. The other day, someone suggested that the total level of student debt in this country, now we're not talking about debt to come, but student debt right now, approximate what we spent on the rape of Iraq. That the Iraq war that killed 1 million people was about as expensive today as the total of student debt in the country right now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, something is very wrong on both of those points,
Yeah.
and it seems to me that we're not going to decide it with, on, as it were, financial grounds.
Yeah.
The war was too expensive, we should have been spending it on something else, seems to me to be a
Yeah.
poor way to go about the question of what
Yeah.
the war was for, and I think in some ways the same thing is true as education, on education. Think again on what education is for, who should have a chance at it, and get away from the notion that it's a filtering system that will open better jobs to people and allow them a living wage. That's wrong.
But it seems to me that one of the implications of what you're arguing, whether it's border control or this, is that in a quote unquote better world that was fair to people in this country and that was fair to people in other countries, not so many people would want to come.
Yes.
There wouldn't be that,
Exactly.
that wouldn't be that reason
right.
there.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still, even in a much better world in this country, there's going to be serious disparities between our economy and those of the global South, and especially the global South that's immediately, that's immediately south to us. So I know there's a lot to think about. I know just to sort of fantasize about this stuff, I don't know. I think it's important to have a vision of a very different world, but that the control, to depend on it's a kind of a free market idea that you're proposing, in the sense that you feel like under certain circumstances, then people will just choose, and those choices will end up to promote the common good.
I don't have the notion of a market at all. It doesn't seem to me that education should be a market.
Okay.
If you had a universal basic income and an open university, a free university system, then you may have to decide what students you are going to admit to your university system, and what sort of limitations, if any, you need to put on them. That may be an issue, but it's not an insoluble one.
Yeah.
And as I say, when we have a university system right now that is really a filtering system for jobs, and we get away from that, then the question changes a lot. For the University of Illinois to say we can admit 50,000 students this year, or we can have an educational establishment with that many students in it, without overstraining the resources we have right now, all those highly paid adjunct professors and so forth.
And graduate employees who are on strike.
Exactly, for just this reason.
Yeah.
But once you decide how to allocate those, once you decide that that's the way you're going to run it, i.e. free higher education and universal basic income, then you can begin to decide, okay, if we have more people who want to come to this university than we have room for, how do we decide who gets in? Well, that's a reasonable question, but you could begin by saying, okay, residents of the state first, residents of the country, the rest of the country second, foreign residents third. People are pointing out right now that hierarchy is upset by the fact that the university gets more money from those foreign students and therefore wants to admit them in order to help its bottom line.
Yeah. And really, who wouldn't want to come to a place which every year on the first Friday in March, students are invited to appropriately get punch drunk before noon? I mean, really, we love our community, don't we?
Yeah, well, it's, you know, there are other objections to that, it
Yeah.
seems to me, quite reasonable ones.
You like to wait till after lunch, I know.
Okay.
All right, but I just want to open up, if this is a can of worms, you know, I just feel like there's been a reluctance to obviously, given the letter that I wrote, which obviously don't have too much room to say a whole lot, but you know, let's look at things in a little bit of a broader context, and let's not be afraid to talk about issues. What happens with identity politics is basically it closes off speech.
Yep.
So I'm for A, I'm for B, I'm, you know, opposed to C.
Exactly.
And if you're on my side or you're not this other side, and of course it creates this sort of discourse which doesn't enlighten us too much about where these problems come from.
If you're nobly opposed to discrimination, that's fine.
Yeah.
But talking about the circumstances that produce the discrimination in the first place doesn't seem quite so fine.
Yeah.
That's, you know,
Yeah.
obviously discrimination should be opposed. But we can't just say oppose discrimination. We have to talk about the structure of the society that produces discrimination and, more importantly, perhaps exploitation before that.
Yeah.
You're watching News from Neptune. We're talking about various issues this week. Top of my list was the remarkable reception, if that's the word, of Russian President Putin's State of the Union address, State of the Union, State of the Nation address. He gives an annual address that could be parallel to the U.S. President's State of the Union address, to the Federal Assembly, as it's called in Russia right now, about the political situation that Russia finds itself in at various times. The speech, I sat and read this year's speech, which was given yesterday. I sat and read this year's speech. It's 2 hours long. It's comparable, perhaps, to President Xi Jinping's speech at the Communist Party conference 2 months ago, month and a half ago. President Putin's talk was extremely interesting and is worth reading, if only to get a sense of the overall technical problems that that Russia is dealing with, in part because of American sanctions and American pressure, both military and economic. It would be worthwhile for Americans to understand that situation rather than the fantasies that we get from the American political establishment. For example, this week, Hillary Clinton, remember her? Hillary Clinton.
Unfortunately, I do.
Yes, exactly. Unfortunately, we all do. Unfortunately, the world does, except for all those dead people who are a result of her administrations. Hillary Clinton wrote this week, I quote, "I say this as a former Secretary of State and as an American. The Russians are still coming. Our intelligence professionals are imploring Trump to act. Will he continue to ignore and surrender or protect our country?" Now, come on. This is Russiagate madness.
You do a great Hillary. You might be
thank
able
you.
to go on Saturday Night Live with that.
Well, I don't know. Well, they've got someone very good to do it. So.
I wouldn't know. I don't watch it.
But this is madness.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the Russiagate madness coming from the Russiagator herself, it represents not the vicious vagaries of a superannuated political figure in the American scene, but a good indication of the nonsense that the American political establishment is putting forward right now. Extremely dangerous nonsense, because it underlies the war provocations against Russia and parallel those against China. There's been the stock and trade of the last administration, and now, unfortunately, of this one as well. She is right to say, she says this as a former Secretary of State. Now, it's this hostile and extremely dangerous challenge that President Putin is responding to this week in his long discussion about the economic development, and that's really what the speech was devoted to, of Russia at the moment. The backstory here is something that Americans don't know. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the American government, soon to be the Clinton administration as it was, decided that this was the opportunity that they'd been looking for a long time. The American government had controlled its own population and a good bit of the rest of the world for many years on the grounds of the Russian threat, the Soviet threat, the communist threat. The communists are coming and we've got to stop them, perhaps by killing people in Southeast Asia or something like that. But still in all, the notion that the threat came from the Soviet Union was a little hard to maintain in the 1990s because there wasn't any Soviet Union anymore. And so what did the U.S. do? It looked around to find other enemies, and in fact it found them without too much problem, but it also decided that its peer competitor, as Zbigniew Brzezinski had called it, the Russia and environs, could now finally be devoured. The U.S. was never challenged in any reasonable fashion by Russia throughout the Cold War, at least until Russia obtained nuclear weapons itself. The American monopoly in nuclear weapons gave way, and Russia, with an economy never more than 50% of the size of the U.S. economy, was able to mount a military force that could indeed counter America's monopoly of nuclear weapons. And that was the big change in the Cold War. When the Cold War came to an end with the collapse of the economic collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. saw its chance, a somewhat dangerous chance from the point of view of its propaganda, to turn Russia into a third world country, a supplier of raw materials, primarily oil, and other things controlled by foreign capital, mainly U.S., of course, capital. And that was indeed the case of Russia throughout the 1990s, throughout the Clinton administration, and to the end of the century. What happened, though, was that the American plan was thwarted by the rise of a new government, a new power center in Russia, presided over by Vladimir Putin, who since the year 2000 has been the effective executive head of the revived Russia. The U.S. thought it had a man in Moscow in the dipsomaniac Boris Yeltsin, but when that ceased to be the case,
Drinking keeps coming up on this program.
it certainly did for the U.S. in that regard.
Yeah.
But when that turned out not to be the case, Russia was able to throw off this plan that the U.S. was supporting and redo itself in the years of the new century. That's in fact what Putin is talking about in the speech that he gave yesterday. The first half, more than half of the speech, the first hour of the speech, is about this economic resurgence, with the reference to, in the background, to the U.S. sanctions that has made that economic resurgence so difficult. And it's worth reading for Americans to get an idea of what Russia indeed has done in the new century. But then he turns to something that produced the headlines in the U.S. He talked about the weapons that the U.S. had, that Russia had, that would prevent nuclear blackmail of Russia of the sort that the U.S. Has tried to practice for many years. We have to understand that the issue here was anti-ballistic missiles, that is, a defensive system that would prevent another country from attacking the country in question with nuclear weapons, with ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. The U.S. has been working for a generation now to establish a defensive system, defensive in the narrow sense of the word, of anti-ballistic missiles that would allow the U.S. to have effectively a first strike capacity on Russia, the ability to attack Russia with nuclear weapons without worrying that Russian nuclear weapons could respond. If the U.S. has a system of ABMs, anti-ballistic missiles, that would prevent Russia responding to an American nuclear attack, then an American nuclear attack becomes possible. A first strike by the U.S. becomes possible. The second half of Putin's speech yesterday was a description of a military and technical situation that he claims to exist now, in which America is no longer able to establish a first strike capacity by being able to destroy Russian missiles, Russian weapons aimed at the U.S. Now, this is presented in the American press as Putin opts for nuclear war and nuclear weapons. What Putin opts for, what Putin explains, is how Russia is able to prevent the U.S. establishing its first strike capacity with so-called defensive weapons, which are not defensive weapons. Is that clear at all?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think some people, at first it's hard to understand the fact that a defensive weapon is an offensive weapon.
Exactly. That's the
But
crucial point.
That's
the crucial point.
what's called a defensive weapon is being developed for offensive purposes on our part, and to take Putin at face value, he's saying, well, if you're going to have this, we're going to have it too.
Well, or what he says actually is that the U.S. anti-missile system won't work because of Russian military advances, and that means that the possibility of an American first strike, which the U.S. has been dining out on for years, has gone down significantly. That Russia is able to defend itself against American first strikes. And that's what's ruffling feathers in the dovecote and foggy bottoms and so forth.
I guess
in the Pentagon.
To refer to the forum we both attended a couple of weeks ago, I guess we might not have to be moving west after all.
Yes. They were just referring to the fact that he and I both sat through a meeting in which a self-proclaimed nuclear engineer advises where to be in the event of a nuclear strike, and she said run west because the prevailing winds come from the west, and that'll blow the stuff east.
Exactly. a lot of confusion on use of Neptune today. Offensive, defensive, west, east.
It's interesting to read the actual speech and to see how it's been presented in the news across the board in American media. The description, the capsule description is that the Western media, in general, European, American, and so forth, accuses Putin of starting a new arms race and issuing, and I'm quoting here, terrifying nuclear missile boasts. Well, the terrifying boasts are Putin's assertion that Russia is not under the threat of an American first strike to the extent that it was before. Now, if that's a boast, I suppose that's fine. The point is, it seems that the insouciance of the Americans about their ability to destroy Russia on a whim, that seems to have gone glimmering, and that's good.
Yeah. You know, I tried to have a deep thought this morning before coming into the program, like I usually do, at least one. I get up early on Friday, so I have time to have at least one deep and profound thought. And the one for this week was, for better or worse, I grew up in a world in which there was allegedly an ideological contrast between our enemy, the Soviet Union, which had some substance to it. They claimed to want a very different world than, and a non-capitalist world, than the United States. And in the last 30 years now, I'm not sure if people have gotten used to the idea that this isn't an ideological conflict anymore. I actually was thinking about this in relation to China, which I'll refer to in a moment. But people somehow they were able to just sort of transfer all this ideological animus into a context in which it's clear that it's all about economic power. It's all about prosperity or alleged prosperity, or it's really about the accumulated wealth of the 1%, whether it may be Russia or here. But these are no longer ideological conflicts. And it's especially obvious with China, which where there was a very good interview that I watched this morning on the Real News Network with a economist and sort of sociologist named Steve Cohen.
Oh, yes.
It's a different. I'm
Yeah,
sorry, it's different. Cohn.
Mm-hmm.
He teaches at Knox College over in Galesburg, and it's about China, and it's about the development of the economics profession in China over the last 40 years, in a very conscious effort to incorporate neoclassical, which is another way of saying neoliberal. Won't go into what the difference is there, but they have made a sincere effort and successful effort to transform their economy in this neoliberal context. It's not an ideology. They sent their economists to our schools to learn these things. And so it's not ideological anymore. It's just about who's going to get more stuff and which elites in which country are going to be top dogs.
I'm a little uncomfortable, David, with the notion that it's not ideological.
I'm surprised.
Yeah, well, in part because I think that the real ideological conflict in the Cold War was constantly and consistently lied about to you when you were in school.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Too.
Okay. It wasn't ideological.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, in that way,
Let's try to sort this out for a minute. I mean, and talk about the Cold War versus now. The Cold War in America was based on the notion that the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc threatened the United States and the countries of the free world with military domination. That tanks were going to roll into Berlin or Paris and so forth with Russians at the controls, and that the U.S. has got to manfully and bravely stand against the threat from the East. Threat from beast from the East in England today is a snowstorm, but still in all. For many, from the 1950s, from the late 40s, for the next two generations, Americans and Europeans were told that there was a threat, a military threat from the East that required a great deal of expensive money, a great deal of monetary expense, and a great deal of military preparedness in order to throw back the ravening hordes of communism. Now, the purpose of that was to organize the economy of Europe under American direction after the Second World War. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was designed, which was advertised as the American-European defense shield against that Soviet threat, the threat from beyond the Iron Curtain, as the great war criminal Winston Churchill put it. That was all a lie. That wasn't true. But there was an ideological threat from the East. That was true. But the ideological threat from the East was the attraction of socialism. As the U.S. saw that it had to reorganize the European economy to have the right number of customers and the economic integration that made for the profits of the American 1% in the years after the Second World War, they realized that the real the real enemy was not Russian tanks. I always liked the fact that it was the U.S. determined that half the Russian mechanized divisions, as the Russians moved into Germany, were horse-drawn. That was a mechanized division in 1945. But in any case, what the ideological fight was about was the attraction of socialism, and what the U.S. was primary to Europeans. To Americans as well, by the way. I mean, this is the story that we're not told much about America in post-war America, and it's a worthwhile story to pay attention to. But the U.S. was very much concerned that the Europeans who had thrown off the Nazi yoke would say, okay, what were we fighting for? Let's organize economies now that really do work for all of us, not just for the economic elite. Well, your American economic elite didn't like the sound of that one bit, and wanted to make sure that the European economies would be organized in favor of elites that looked like them. Indeed, were them in many cases. That was the ideological fight. But the ideological fight was a battle by the night. It couldn't be done openly and honestly. The U.S. couldn't say, we don't want you all attracted to socialism. We want to make sure that you have a capitalist or neoliberal structure that pays us and impoverishes you. Therefore, we had to have a myth, a fake story, a cover story. And that cover story was Russian aggression.
But along with that came the rise of the social democratic welfare state, mainly in Europe, but in this country as well to a certain extent.
That's true. And that's because the population had to be bought off.
Sure.
The crucial graph here is the graph of inequality, economic inequality in the United States. And the statistics are fairly straightforward, but it takes a little time to see exactly what's being said. The notion that economic inequality can be measured on something that's usually referred to as the Gini index, from the work of a fascist economist, by the way, at the beginning of the 20th century, talks about a society in which one person owns everything.
Yeah.
And that would be a Gini index of 1.0.
Mm-hmm.
A Gini index of 0 would be a society in which everything is owned, everybody owns an equal share of everything. So most societies, not surprisingly, are somewhere between those 2 points. We don't have one person owning everything, but we don't have things equally divided either. It's somewhere in between. And the index suggests how concentrated that wealth is, or how unequal the society is. Well, American society reached a peak of inequality right before the stock market crash in 1929. And through the Depression and the New Deal reforms and the reorganization that came with the Second World War, inequality declined in the United States from a peak in 1929 to a trough in the late 60s. American society has never been more equal than it was in the late 60s, which raises some other interesting questions too. But the point is that that curve turned around in the late 60s, in the early 70s, and started up again. The age of neoliberalism has seen not only, the last 40 years, has seen not only an increase in inequality, but an accelerating increase in inequality, so that we are back today to the situation in 1929. That's the situation that had to be dealt with. And the U.S. has done that. The U.S. 1% has done that with massive propaganda of all sorts, including propaganda about how free we are and how repressed those poor Russians are who are getting in their tanks and coming to seize Paris.
So what is the conclusion about ideology and the role of ideology? The word ideology, however you want to say it. What is the role? I mean, there is a role in reality that we're talking about. We're talking about systems of the way in which we think about the world that have real consequences in terms of the way the world works. But we're also talking about about ideas that are basically that misrepresent the world in ways that keep people down, that keep people
Absolutely.
confused, that keep people powerless. So are you arguing that hasn't really changed? I mean, during the Cold War or since the Cold War, that the basic function of that hasn't been changed, or that it never was that important, what people were actually thinking and saying about capitalism and fascism and communism and Marxism and socialism and so forth.
I think it's vital, and I think the great problem is that we don't have a clear and open discussion of those matters. That's why you and I come in here each week, right?
Now I know why we're here.
But the point was from the perspective of the American 1%, this ideology was absolutely essential as propaganda against the only enemy that the American 1% really feared after the Second World War, and that was the American populace. They had to be convinced that the situation they were living in was necessary because of outside enemies, because of the nature of the economy, etc. They had to be convinced of that so that they would not interfere with the reconstitution by the American ruling class of that situation of inequality that existed before the war. That's what American propaganda since 1945 has been about. There's a famous story told about Michigan Senator Arthur Vandenberg and Harry Truman. Harry Truman, who was president in succession to Franklin Roosevelt by the connivance of the American 1%, faced a real problem after the Second World War. Truman was speaking for people who knew that it was the war that had solved the Depression, and with the ending of the war, the Depression probably would be back if the profits of the American 1% were to be maintained. What do I do, Arthur, said Harry Truman, in order to get that wartime spirit back? And Vandenberg says, you have to scare hell out of the American people. And the Truman administration used the Russian threat, the Soviet threat, the threat of communism, to scare hell out of the American people and try to reestablish the economic situation that had existed during the war, had ended the Depression, and redounded to the support of the American 1%. It worked. It worked very well. And that was the problem, 2 generations later when the Soviet Union disappeared.
So what does the American ruling class have now? I mean, these are slightly rhetorical questions on my part, but indulge me. I mean, what does the ruling class have now to scare the American people with? It no longer has communism. It seems to me that it has demonic figures like Putin, and now Xi to a certain extent, since Xi decided, the Chinese leader, Xi, decided that he would be in power as long as he wants, and that's been made a big deal out of. Exactly. I think it's completely silly.
It is very silly.
But still, that's what they're saying, because they want, it's not communism, the word, the bugaboo word is authoritarianism,
right.
and then fascism,
Yeah.
and then fascism resurgent in Europe and so forth.
Right.
And so these are the supposed ideas behind these other countries that are opposed to our wonderful and pure ideas about democracy and freedom, and the fact that capitalism allegedly is consistent with those ideas, which of course it never has been. So.
Yeah, and we've coined a term for it that I think may be useful. We speak of populism.
Right,
usually,
of course.
Usually with a sneering facial expression in both the U.S. and around the world. There's a germ of truth in that notion. When we say that populist ideas are appearing on the right in Europe, or populism produced the Trump administration, or populism produced Brexit, there is, as I say, a germ of truth in this if we understand by populism not a general racism, as the Democrats wanted to tell us in the last election. We understand by populism the somewhat inchoate notion in the society at large that the interests of the majority, and the real interests, the economic interests, the practical interests of the majority, are being worked against by someone somewhere, and that's as a result, the interests of the majority are not being attended to. Well, that's unformed as that view may be, it has the interesting property of being correct. It's accurate. Populism begins with this sort of inchoate recognition that the 1%, the economic elite in Europe and America, and perhaps elsewhere, working against the economic interests of the majority. That's true. And therefore, when we have populist outbreaks of politics, they have to be excoriated by the intellectual ascendancy in this country and others, or the truth will break out. Populism is right in its apperception. The question is, what then is to be done?
And the viciousness which populism is attacked, I think partly reflects the fact that that's the only game in town, with the relative paucity of socialism, or you've only got Bernie. I guess Bernie Sanders was called populist
Yes,
in that derogatory way, although by someone like me he would be called that in a more positive way. But still,
other reasons to be derogatory about Bernie.
Yes, yes, right. I get that. That's a whole different issue. But still. All of this intensity partly is because of the lack of demons, of the Soviet demon, the Marxist demon, the socialist demon, whatever you want to call it. That's being directed at the only game in town for a lot of people. For a lot of people, this sort of populism, including Trump, whatever you want to call Trump, it was the only game in town vis-a-vis Hillary Clinton.
That's right.
So.
And since remember that what Hillary Clinton promised was a continuation and indeed an intensification of the neoliberal and neoconservative policies of the Obama administration. More of the same and even more so. And people are not fools. I mean, people looked around and saw that and said, well, whether you call it Republican or Democrat, here's what's going on, here's what's being offered, and that's not what I want. What I want is closer to what people are calling populism, even though there is a tremendous attempt to colonize the language and make that the real issue. We have to decide, are you on the left or right? Are you Republican or Democrat, and so forth. Artificial divisions that really don't relate to the actual experience or the real political wishes, which can hardly be expressed, of a majority of the populace. We would begin, it seems to me, in this discussion if we were to understand that the Sanders campaign, for all its deficiencies, and the Trump campaign, for all its deficiencies, came from the same source. They both represented, and I would throw in that to keep the ball rolling, the Brexit campaign in Britain. All of them came from the same source. From this unformed apperception that the people were being done, and that they were being done by self-interested minorities who did not have the peace and prosperity of the majority at heart. That's all true, that's quite right, and the first thing that minority wants to do is divide and rule the perception that that's what's going on. So we have Sanders campaign and Trump campaign understanding themselves as separate things rather than what in fact they were, both expressions of this populist sentiment.
I'm going to throw a softball question at you, Carl. I think it's a softball question, maybe not. What was your reaction to the PR that was given to the bipartisan foreign policy of Sanders and Mike Lee from Utah? regarding Yemen and regarding the authorization for the use of military force. The Real News Network was sort of, I mean, they were publicizing it, they were making maybe not a big deal out of it, but they were making a deal out of it. I'm not sure how it was covered in the mainstream media, if it was at all. So given all that, what do you think? Is this much ado about nothing, or?
It's a very good question, and it does indeed touch on exactly what we've been talking about. The war in Yemen, which the U.S. has been backing directly, is such a scandal, such a crime, such an obvious crime, that something had to be done.
Yes.
And so we
even Democrats have to do something about it.
That's right. What we have is this this resolution introduced by two senators that would withdraw American support for the Saudi depredations in Yemen. That, as you say, that's obviously good. What's not good, as was pointed out by our friend Francis Boyle at the law school, was that same resolution supports America's war in the Mideast, the global war against terrorism, as it used to be called, and the fiery liberal spirit, Bernie Sanders, is down with the American assault on the Middle East in general, including the vicious American-supported war in Syria. This is terrible. It seems to me, if we want to understand what's happening politically here, we simply have to say that the scandal has become so great that something had to be done, something reasonable had to be done. That is, say, the U.S. should stop killing people in Yemen, in order, in some ways, to protect the ongoing killing that the last administration and this one have been so good at. So it seems to me that, yeah, you're right. It's a tiny step in the right direction, but primarily made to defend the very serious steps in the wrong direction that have been the stock and trade of the last administration.
I'm afraid that applies to a lot of things Democrats do in Congress, or Democrats in general do. One sort of perhaps related to this, but I was going to mention it anyway. Doug Henwood did a really amazing interview last week, I think perhaps his most recent show, I'm not sure if he's done one this week, with a woman who's writing an article, a long article, not yet out, about a guy named Gene Sharp. Oh, yeah. And I learned an enormous amount. This was an hour-long interview, which he doesn't usually do, or maybe 50 minutes. And we found out all about Gene Sharp, who the most famous man nobody's ever heard of, or the most whatever that nobody's ever heard of. I think from Harvard, your Harvard days, you probably know a little more about him. And it's quite revealing. It's quite revealing about the relationship that he had with the foreign policy elite that's being exposed. Gene Sharp came to public notice during the Arab Spring because apparently he was inspiring some of the activists during the Arab Spring. But it's much more complicated than that. Gene Sharp was actually an apparatchik in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, and that's what makes this interview so fascinating. Beyond which, the fact that he, at least in some cases, had the support of people like Chomsky and Howard Zinn. So very, very strange stuff that perhaps we ought to talk about on a future program.
I'll put a link to this program, to this podcast.
Interview podcast,
that Doug Henwood does on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, which you have been watching for the 9th week of 2018, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scholarite. This has been a Rootin' for Putin edition. Our thanks, I hope I'll get some heat on that. Our thanks to our research director, Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, the third man on News from Neptune. No's notes are posted on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Along with the Oscars, the Italian elections are Sunday. One, if not the other, might tell us how restless Europe is under neoliberalism and American control, and U.S. provocations of Russia, like sanctions against Russia, which Europe reluctantly observes, and we'll talk about both next week, inshallah, in a new edition of News from Neptune. To remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.